Welcome to the first ever YFA Journal Club, at least in a Facebook live stream rather than a course. This is a new offering. Um, we want to make research more accessible to the yoga community. And so this is something that we're going to start doing, and we hope that it spreads like wildfire and that people really appreciate it. It's also a nice opportunity to highlight our 300 hour that's launching that has an evidence-informed focus. So if you have more questions about that, let us know. Okay, so the way that Journal Club in an academic setting generally functions is that in advance, everybody reads an article from the research literature, and then they get together and discuss it and learn things from each other's view of the article, kind of like a book club, actually a lot like a book club, right? Everybody reads the book, shows up, talks about how they interpret it, what they got from it, what they think of it, etc. So it works a lot like that. If you read the article, amazing. If you did not read the article, also totally fine. You can always come to Journal Club whether or not you have read it. You get more out of it if you have, right? And by read, we're all in different places in our research literacy journey. And so reading the article for you, maybe just like starting to dip your toes in the water of looking at a research article. Unfortunately, a lot of people are intimidated by the research literature because it's written in a particular dialect of English that not everybody has learned or is familiar with. And so that can make it pretty intimidating. I encourage you to try. So in future journal clubs, just give it a whirl. It's also an opportunity to practice your yoga in the reading of it. You know, non-judgment and acceptance and contentment with whatever arises. Notice if you're a little bit uncomfortable, if you don't understand some of the vocabulary. If it's frustrating, notice it's okay to feel frustrated. It's okay to not understand something. It's a practice. And the way that we get more literate with the research literatures, the way that you get more literate with any language or dialect, which is through exposure to it. So the more that you encounter this vocabulary, these concepts, the more familiar they will become. You can do that intentionally by, for each article you read, maybe looking up some word or some concept that's unfamiliar to you and learning a little bit more about it, or let it happen organically. And as you come across things and see them in context, they'll start to make more sense to you. So I want to show you first how I landed on this article, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Oh, Kylie is telling me that she needs co-host back. So let me give her that. All right. And I'm going to share my screen um, to show you how I landed on this particular article that I've selected for today. So this is PubMed. You can get to this in any browser. So it has this long thing here, but literally if you just put PubMed, um, and you search, you will land on this page. Okay, so here we are, PubMed, and I will, in the 300 hour and in my book that will be coming out hopefully sometime this year, actually teach you the strategies for developing a search string, what's called a search string. What you put in this search bar matters, the saying garbage in, garbage out. So if you search with an inappropriate search string, you're going to get the wrong literature than what you're looking for. But rather than get into that today, I'm going to just put in the terms yoga and arthritis, which is literally what I did. So when you don't put anything in between your terms, it defaults to and. So when I put yoga and arthritis in here separately, it's defaulting to only showing me articles that have both yoga and arthritis. If I wanted yoga or arthritis, yoga not arthritis, I could put something different in between. But if I want to just see all the papers that have both yoga and arthritis in them, I can do it really simply like this. And the article I chose is literally the first one. So I have these sorted by publication date, which means this is the most recent paper that has been published on yoga and arthritis. And I could have, done all sorts of things to narrow my search, but it turns out because I wanted to make sure that this paper was free for everyone to access and didn't require a subscription. Turns out that this one is free, and you can see right here that it's free. Okay, so there are a bunch of reasons why I am glad that this was the top article that showed up, but I'm going to show you how to get to it. Okay, so I click on it here, and you're not going to have this thing that says view PDF. That's a separate software that I own that you're probably not going to have pop up on yours. But when I enter this here, so I can see the title, the authors, and the abstract. And I want to remind everybody, the abstract is like a movie trailer. You cannot read an abstract and think that you know what the article includes. The point of the abstract is for you to decide whether or not you want to read the article. It gives you an idea. You would never watch a movie trailer and write a review of the movie based on the trailer, right? It's supposed to give you a glimpse of what this paper is like. If I want to actually read the paper itself, then I go up here to the right, and here are the full text links. Okay, so this is the one to the journal itself. This is the one to the free full text version through PubMed. So I'm going to click on that. And right here, I have an opportunity to download the PDF. So I can read it right here in in my browser. But if I want the PDF, then I click PDF, and then here I am. Here I have access to the PDF. Okay, so this is how I get to the article. Now I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger so that we can all see it better. And I'm going to walk you through this. So, barriers and facilitators to yoga practice among people living with arthritis, a qualitative systematic review. In a good title, it's going to tell us the basic study methodology that was used. And this is a systematic review. And I'm going to actually take us over to a reminder. Oops, not here, because I already have that open. I want to take us over here to a reminder of the evidence hierarchy. So I've covered this in some other lives that I've done. This pyramid does not say that the research at the top is good and the research at the bottom is bad. What this tells us is about the risk of bias in different types of research designs. Now, each of these designs has value. Each of them is used to answer different kinds of research questions, all of which are valid. The higher you get on the pyramid, the lower the risk of bias in that particular type of study design. Now, within any band, there is high and low quality research, right? So there are some individual case reports that are incredibly well written, and there are others that are really vague and unclear and not particularly useful. So there's a whole range of quality within one of these categories, but you see that systematic reviews are way up here. They're in this category called critical appraisal. So down here we have observations. Right here is this is not research. This is expert opinion, right? Background information, guidelines that are not grounded in the evidence. Here is where we get observational studies. So studies that are just looking at things that are happening in the real world, phenomena that are already occurring that we're collecting data about to better understand it. These are experiments, randomized controlled trials, and not. And then here we get to critical appraisals. Critical appraisals, so this is also called summary research. It's where we're looking at a whole bunch of different research, pulling it all together and evaluating it. And so there's less risk of bias because each individual study is going to have some type of bias. And when we combine a bunch of different studies together to say something about it as a whole, we're going to be reducing some of the bias of individual studies. So what we're looking at in this paper is a systematic review. What makes it a systematic review are a few different characteristics of it that I'm going to point out. As the title suggests, it's reviewed systematically. And as we go through it, I'll sort of show you a little bit about what that means. So this is a systematic review, meaning that it's pulled together information from a bunch of different studies to say something about them as a whole. This is a qualitative systematic review. So quantitative research looks at numbers, qualitative research looks at text. They answer different kinds of questions. They also have different kinds of methodologies. Qualitative research tends to tell a story, whereas quantitative research is giving you a picture of some numeric data, right? Quantitative research can be subjective or objective, right? You can have measures like a stress scale that's going to be subjective, or blood pressure, which is going to be objective, both of which are numeric. Qualitative research is always subjective because it's telling stories. It's people's perspective, their experiences, and therefore subjective, but it can still have an incredible amount of value, and it answers different types of questions than quantitative research can. In this particular systematic review, they were looking at barriers and facilitators to yoga practice. So what makes it more or less likely that somebody living with arthritis is going to practice yoga? What are the barriers? What gets in the way of yoga practice? What are facilitators? What makes it easier for people to practice yoga? I love that this came up as the first one on the list because it's so incredibly relevant to people living with arthritis who want to practice yoga, but may find that there are some barriers and be looking for what could make it easier for me to practice. And people who teach yoga or offer yoga therapy to people living with arthritis who want to maybe optimize the facilitators and reduce the barriers. It can also be really relevant to administrators or policymakers who want to make yoga more accessible to people living with arthritis. So I thought this was an incredibly useful paper. I also want to demonstrate that not all useful research is a randomized controlled trial, especially, people love to poke holes in the idea of a randomized controlled trial for traditional medicines or integrative health. Not all research is a randomized controlled trial. This is research to look at what makes it easier or harder for people with arthritis to practice yoga, and that's incredibly valuable literature. So when we look at the abstract, which remember is a summary, it first gives us a little bit of background as to why this question is important, because we want to understand what makes it easier or harder for people with arthritis to practice yoga. And then they tell us a little bit about the methodology that they use. This is called an unstructured abstract, which means that it's all just a block of text. A structured abstract has headings where it sort of breaks up this text into categories like the background, the methodology. It still is the same information, but it's all in one paragraph. And what it tells us is how they found the research, all of the databases that they searched, how they screened it for methodological quality. And that's an important characteristic of a systematic review, is that they assess the quality of the literature. And it tells us a little bit about the studies that they ended up finding, and then how they analyzed those findings, and then what they found. Okay, so that just tells us a little bit of an overview of what they did. Notably, these researchers are all based in the UK. So oftentimes research is international, meaning that there are investigators across different countries. These are all investigators in the UK at a few different institutions, but it does tell us something about the lens that they're approaching this research through. And they do mention in the abstract and later in the paper that all of the studies that they found happen to be in high-income countries, the US, the UK, and New Zealand, and with a majority of female participants. So that does create some bias in the findings, meaning that what we find here in terms of facilitators and barriers may not apply to other types of countries, may not apply to male participants, for example. So it's important to understand that bias, but what it does do is it says that the facilitators and barriers that we uncover may actually be particularly relevant to especially female participants and especially in high income countries. Okay. So the introduction is going to give us a background of the problem. It sets the stage. It tells us about arthritis. It tells us about the treatments for arthritis. It tells us about yoga and how it's relevant to arthritis, right? It's recommended for arthritis management. It then also tells us a little bit about qualitative research. Qualitative research can help answer a why. We're never going to get a why from measuring, joint damage, right? If we want to understand a why, we have to ask people why. And that's the type of question that qualitative research can answer. This systematic review looked at papers that identified barriers, things that can impede, and facilitators, things that can encourage yoga practice. And they're saying that this has never been done before in a systematic review. Again, as they mentioned in the abstract, they're showing us something about the rigor here by telling us how they adhered to certain parameters of systematic reviews of qualitative evidence. And these are things that you can look up to understand better where they registered this so that they told us in advance what they plan to do. This is a check so that we can see that they actually did what they said they were going to do. When you're going to conduct a clinical trial or a systematic review or other types of research, you register the protocol in advance to say, here's what we plan to do. And then other investigators or readers can look back at the final results and make sure that you did what you said you were going to do. And if there were any changes between what you planned and what you ended up doing, that you justified that in what you wrote. Okay, so that's a check against bias. These are the different databases that they searched, and it's important to search a variety of different databases so that you're not limited to what may be in one database and not another. So to get a more comprehensive view of the literature, they also, beyond the published literature, also searched dissertation and theses for things that may not be published yet. And they were looking at yoga and arthritis, just like we did, with a whole bunch of different filters to look specifically at qualitative papers like this. Okay, they then evaluated the methodological quality. So they looked through the quality of the data, and they had two independent reviewers. And this is a characteristic of systematic reviews also to reduce the bias that a single reviewer might have. Two independent reviewers evaluated all of the studies to check for the quality. And then, when they don't meet consensus, when they don't agree on something, they get together and figure it out together. And when they don't find consensus together, they involve a senior reviewer. This is common, right? You have the two reviewers and then you have a third party to weigh in when they can't agree on something. And then the two reviewers also extracted the data and resolved any disagreements with a third reviewer. So these are all standard measures of high quality research conduct. And then all of the authors were reviewed in synthesizing the data, right? Figuring out what the data says overall. It says the studies that were included are available in Figure 1. So you see how this is a hyperlink. I'm going to click on the one so that you can see this process. This is called a Prisma flow diagram, and it walks us through where they started and where they landed, how they ended up with the studies that they ended up with. Now, you can see that there were a whole bunch of studies that they found at the very beginning across all of these. And then at each stage in the process, you're going to see why papers get eliminated. So 376 of them were eliminated because they were duplicates across two or more of the databases, right? So obviously you're going to eliminate duplicates. And then they screened the ones that were left. And there were a bunch that did not meet criteria for screening. Usually that means that they didn't actually address facilitators and barriers. So they weren't answering the types of questions that this systematic review was looking at. So 15 of them actually met criteria. None of those were unable to be retrieved. So they got all 15 of those and then looked at whether or not they were eligible. Six of those were excluded because they weren't actually answering the right question or they were a conference abstract or a study protocol. So they weren't a study itself. So they included eight, and there were nine reports of eight studies, which means that there was one study that had two different reports about it. Okay, so it may seem like, wow, they started off with all of these papers and they ended up with so few. That's actually really common because you go through a process to figure out which ones are relevant to the question that you're answering. Okay, so we go back up here. Now that we know they looked at eight different studies with nine reports, we have a table one that describes the characteristics of the eight that they included. So now we can look at table one. So I'm going to click on this one. It's going to take us here to this table. And this is kind of hard to read, right? Because it's sideways. So up here, I can actually flip it. I'm going to flip it around. And now I can see the characteristics of each of these studies. And these are actually papers that I know pretty well because they're in our area of yoga and arthritis. And it's telling you these are all qualitative papers, where they were published, what they were looking at, where they got the participants, where they were recruited from, where the yoga was delivered, the methodology that they used, how many people and the characteristics of those people, how the data was collected, and then the technique that they used for analyzing it. Um, of note, this is Leslie Ward, who is a dear colleague of mine. I know that paper well. And then this is Kimberly Middleton. I am actually an investigator and a co-author on this paper. And some of you in the Yoga for Arthritis community may be familiar. This is where we delivered the Yoga for Arthritis program for African American and Spanish speaking patients at the NIH Arthritis Clinic, and we looked at facilitators and barriers. So there were multiple papers that came out of that project, including actually evaluating the effects quantitatively, but we also did qualitative research, including structured interviews. And we also qualitatively analyzed journals that the participants kept, which they don't mention here, but that was part of the qualitative literature as well. And these papers go all the way through 2022. So we are capturing a wide range of dates here. And we have OA, we have RA, and that looks like the extent of it. People with RA and OA. Okay, so those are the papers that we're looking at. I also noted the types of yoga was delivered. So these are Iyengar. This is chair yoga. We've got some general yoga. This is Hatha yoga here. Yoga therapy based in Vini-Yoga, another Hatha yoga. So you can see the types of yoga that were being delivered as well. Okay, so I'm going to actually come down further and I need to flip it back again. And this has the critical appraisal of the eight studies that were included. So I can flip to table two here. And now this evaluated the reporting quality of the studies that were here, the appraisal of them. This is how high quality this literature is, right? And so a bunch of them are hundreds, which means that this is actually a pretty high quality collection of papers. And you might be curious for the ones that have lower ratings, question one, question six and seven, what was unclear? So when it's unclear, they couldn't tell whether something was included or not. And so we're going to actually go down here where it tells us, actually, I think we might need to go up, where it tells us what each of these questions is in the JBI, right? This is what they used for critical appraisal. So Q1 is inadequate reporting of the congruity between the stated philosophical perspective and the research methodology. And you can see here that most of them it's not clear, which just means that it wasn't explicitly stated in most of the papers. If we're looking at Q6 and Q7, congruity between the research methodology and the interpretation of results, and a statement locating the researcher culturally and theoretically. I will note that the Middleton paper did that. We actually got a Y on everything except for this first one. So pat on the back to us for that. So it's showing you a little bit about the quality of the approach and the reporting. Okay, now let's get to the findings. So table 3 is where they aggregate the findings. I'm going to take you down there. And the way that qualitative research happens is that you look at all of the text and then you synthesize that text into major themes and then sub-themes, ideas within the theme. And so they did that on aggregate. They took the findings from all of these different papers and they sort of pulled them together into an overall summary about what the facilitators and barriers were across all of these studies. So they have 5 different themes, and within those themes, they identify sub-themes, barriers and facilitators. And so I find this really interesting. The first is about the body, the impacts and the anticipated and experienced impacts of yoga on the physical body for people with arthritis. The next is the mind, motivation and perceived impact on mental well-being. The next is the mind-body impact. Then is session structure and accessibility. And then is the session environment. Okay. So within each of those, there are barriers and facilitators. If I were a yoga professional, I would spend a lot of time on this table and really unpack these. Okay. So these are the things about yoga's effect on the physical body that can be barriers. And these are the things about yoga's impact on the physical body that can be facilitators. So on the one hand, if we're not sure about yoga's benefits, that might discourage practice. On the other hand, if we experience relief from arthritis symptoms, that can be a facilitator, right? As an example. If I were a yoga teacher, I might be particularly interested in things that I can control, right? Like, for example, a barrier being unsatisfactory yoga experiences, including the difficulty level and discomfort that hindered practice. Okay, so if I want to really understand more about 4B, how can I do that? Well, I can go down into the elaboration of it. Okay, so here they have quotes that exemplify each of those concepts. So if we go to 4B, here are a couple of quotes from some of the papers that demonstrate this concept. It was really hard to bend my joints. I felt like it wasn't for me or people with arthritis. It gave me so much stress. The therapist was trying to find out, like something in my life which has caused this thing. So this sub-theme is about it not being tailored appropriately for people with arthritis. And this seems to be about intrusiveness, right? So if I go back up here for B, unsatisfactory experiences, including the level of practice and discomfort. So that could be physical discomfort, but it can also be psychological discomfort, right? Oh, okay, that's really important to consider. Now, if we go down below to this elaboration, the authors actually talk more about each of these. So I can go down to 4B, unsatisfactory yoga experiences, right? This is the theme. And what they say here is there are 2 findings that showed how the delivery of yoga sessions affected yoga practice. So 2 concepts within that sub-theme. Some description of the yoga that was not modified adequately according to people's specific needs with arthritis, which anyone who's been trained in the Yoga for Arthritis program knows that this is absolutely essential. So it made it physically challenging for them to practice. So that suggests there weren't enough options being offered. The options weren't appropriate or accessible. There wasn't enough choice, etc. Right? All of those tenets of the yoga for arthritis philosophy. And then this next concept is the intrusive nature of the yoga therapist in a therapy session, leading to stress and discomfort. So, the approach that the yoga provider used to try to understand the lived experience of the person with arthritis did not create psychological safety in the experience. So I'm just pulling out 4B as an example, but you could go through all of these to better understand the specifics, right? So here's another example: well-paced sessions, adaptability, making it helpful. Okay. And there are 6 different findings within that category about how the practice can be tailored to also help people accept their limitations, be more compassionate toward themselves instead of feeling pressured to achieve a certain pose that might not suit their bodies. Safe and supportive space, a therapeutic environment, right? These all being facilitators to practice. So we could go through all of those elaborations on the themes, and then comes the discussion. And then in the discussion, this is where the authors tell us what they think about the findings. So they put these findings in the context of the existing literature, right? What we knew prior to this, and the conclusions that they draw about the importance of these findings. So they're drawing out all of these major themes about the body, the mind, the body-mind, the session context and the environment, the session structure and the environment. And then it talks about some other research that is also relevant to this type of question. What's novel from it, how it builds on what we already knew prior to this. And then usually it ends with some of the limitation, what was strong about the way that they approached the study and what the limits were, right? So a limit being, for example, that it was focused on osteo and rheumatoid arthritis, that there weren't many male participants, that these are all in high income countries, and so it may not generalize, right? The barriers and facilitators might be different in different contexts. And what should come next, right? What other studies should build on this, and what you can conclude from it, right? They talk about their conflict of interest. So this is a requirement where they got their funding, so you can get a sense of, what their biases might be. And then this is the conclusion. So this is the overall summary of what they would say. If you're going to take away anything from this paper, here's what we suggest taking away from it. And then, of course, all of these references. So every paper that you encounter has more to find in the references. This is where you can go down even more of a rabbit hole on this concept by looking at what they cited, and also the 8 or 9 papers that they evaluated. You could go into each of those and dig deeper into what they found individually. They tell you what the authors each contributed, and I'm going to stop the share there. And I'm going to tell you, so I hope that this gives you a sort of familiarity with the structure of what these papers look like, how to move through them and understand what the different pieces are. That not all research is about number crunching, that there are things that we can get that are valuable from research that is an evaluation of text. And, that not all research is about, well, actually, research should never be about proving something. There's nothing we can prove in human subjects research, right? We can only gather more evidence and contribute to what we know. So I think it was in a prior Facebook Live that somebody said, where can we find research to show how beneficial yoga is? Well, that's not how we want to approach the literature. We want to approach the literature to see what we can learn and how it can inform the way that we communicate about yoga, the way that we deliver yoga, the way that we practice yoga. So, what this paper can offer us is some guidance for how to teach in a way that might be more accessible. There are also, remember I said, a yoga teacher might want to focus on the things that we can control, but there are things in there that we can't necessarily control that are important to be aware of. So, a lot of those themes looked at perceived or actual experiences, anticipated experiences. So if people are concerned that the yoga practice might make their arthritis worse, that's going to be a barrier, whether it actually is or is not, right? And so that's important to be aware of, that your students might be avoiding yoga, or your potential students might be avoiding yoga because they're worried that it might hurt. So what does that mean in terms of your approach, in terms of your marketing, in terms of your offerings, in terms of your compassion and how you receive your students to a class, especially students who are new to yoga? Right. So I think that this type of paper can be really informative. And when I say that yoga teachers often have a blind spot when it comes to the research literature, these are not things that you would necessarily know from your yoga teacher training, right? You can take a training and it's not going to tell you things that people living with arthritis are going to tell you directly. This is from the horse's mouth, so to speak. These are real people with arthritis telling you how they feel about yoga and what makes it more likely that they're going to practice and less likely that they're going to practice. So I think that this is really rich and useful information, and the kind of thing that research can contribute that you're not going to get elsewhere. You're not going to find this information in the Bhagavad Gita, as valuable as that is and important as that is in informing the way that you teach yoga. This is a different kind of information that you're not going to get anywhere else. So I hope that that highlights some of the value of the research literature as well. And if you find this intimidating because there's a lot of jargon, look for what you can get out of it. There's always some little nugget, even if it's a single sentence that you find to be particularly powerful, that you can come back to again and again because of how it lands for you. When you come back to the paper another time, you might find a different little nugget that's really valuable. There are papers that I read now that are full of a lot of information that I don't immediately understand because it's not in my field directly, or it's tangential to the work that I do. Something that is really deeply embedded in the physiology of neuroscience that is not something that I am studying a whole lot right now. And so some of that is foreign to me, and then I have to look things up, or some of it feels a little intimidating. But if I read a sentence again and again, I start to get it. I also picked this because it doesn't have any numbers in it. It's all qualitative, it's all words. And so hopefully that makes it a little bit less intimidating as well, because we are a species that thinks and shares in stories. And so this kind of research can be compelling because it's all about the story. It's people sharing their why, right? Which is something I think that we can all relate to. So with that, I want to open it up to questions, comments. So whether you read this or you didn't read it, do you have questions about what was found? If there is anything in the paper specifically that you read that didn't really make sense to you that you want me to unpack for you? If you read it and there was something that stood out to you as really compelling or surprising or validating, let's hear that. So, Kylie, if there's anybody sharing in the Facebook comments, if you want to bring that to my attention, that would be great. And anybody that's here in the Zoom, if you want to share. Okay, no questions on Facebook yet. Any in the room here in the Zoom?
I really appreciated you breaking it down the way you did, because I'll be honest, I was pretty intimidated when I went to read the paper. But I was also pleased that I noted the biases right off the bat. Um, I do have a question in that. So what would be the minimum number of papers to be a valid meta and or systematic review?
Yeah, great question, Lori. Okay, so you started to say meta-analysis and then you changed it to systematic review. So I just want to distinguish those from each other first, and then I'll answer your question. So when I was in the paper, let me see if I can pull it up. When I shared the evidence hierarchy previously, you notice that the very top of this pyramid is meta-analysis. And so we're looking at a systematic review, which is one tier down. What's the difference between these? Well, a meta-analysis actually takes all of the data from a bunch of different papers. So it actually starts with a systematic review. You have to do a systematic review first before you can do a meta-analysis. The systematic review pools all of the data together, and then a meta-analysis analyzes it as one data set. Okay, so in order to conduct a meta-analysis, you would have to have a numeric data set. So a qualitative systematic review cannot have a meta-analysis done on it because there's no quantitative analysis being done, right? There's no statistical analysis to do because there's no large numeric data set. So you could have, if you're looking at quantitative data, like let's say you're looking at the effects of yoga practice on blood pressure. So you could get a bunch of different papers that all look at the effects of yoga on blood pressure, and you could do a systematic review like we did here. And then you could take all of the data together, pool it all together, and analyze it as one giant data set. And that would be a meta-analysis. Because this is qualitative research, we can't pool all of the data into a meta-analysis. So the highest you can get in qualitative research would be a systematic review, just to make that distinction. And I think there's somebody that maybe needs to be muted. Um, Let me see if I can do that. Yep, it's done. Okay. So I just first want to make that distinction. And then to answer your question, um, there is no answer to that. There's no one number that says this is enough for it to be valid. The more papers you include, the less bias there is, the more, especially the more different types of papers, especially, so you can imagine for this one, the more different types of yoga, right? So this review, it was mostly Iyengar yoga, Hatha yoga, some things that just said yoga and didn't necessarily specify, Vini yoga. And so what we can say about that as a whole is limited to those approaches to yoga. So you could imagine that a review that had many more different, oh yeah, chair yoga was in there as well. The many more different types of yoga, the more generalizable it would be, right? And so the more studies you have, the more, and you could imagine the more different types of countries, the more generalizable it would be. That being said, it being narrow can also be beneficial. So let's say this was only looking at facilitators and barriers of chair yoga. Well, we wouldn't be able to take that and say anything about an Iyengar yoga class, but we could say, here's a lot of information that's specifically about chair yoga that we can apply to chair yoga. So it's apples to apples instead of a fruit basket to a fruit basket. So it's not bad when it's narrow, it's just limited in terms of what you can apply it to. And the more papers you have, the more different kinds of information, the more different people were involved, the more different perspectives. I've seen systematic reviews that were done that resulted in like two papers. Honestly, to me, there's very little point in doing a systematic review with that few papers because it doesn't add much more than the individual papers themselves. I think sometimes authors do a review when there's very little literature to highlight their own work or to make a point that there needs to be more done in this area. It gives them a way to be able to cite that review and say, this review identified XYZ, more work needs to be done, and then that justifies the more work that they need to be done. So, especially if you see a systematic review and the person who's doing the systematic review is also the person that wrote the two papers that are in the systematic review, that kind of, it doesn't contribute much, I would say. In this case, some of the authors actually are also authors on some of the papers that are included. That's not a bad thing. It's because those are the experts that are in the field, right? So Evans, who published one or two of the papers that are in that list of nine, is also a co-author on this systematic review. That's because Evans is an expert in this field, has been doing research in yoga for arthritis for many years, knows a lot about it, and is doing a review to see what is this collection of evidence by all of these other authors pooled with mine have to say about facilitators and barriers overall. So that's not a bad thing. Um, I don't know that that's probably not a satisfying answer, Lori, but so what you generally want to see is that in a robust area of research, every so many years, there should be a new review to synthesize what do we know now that we didn't know when the last review was done. So this one is a review that's never been done before. So this is the first systematic review of facilitators and barriers of yoga for arthritis. The literature that was covered spanned, I think, like 2010 to 2022. So that's a pretty, wide span. And before that, there probably wasn't even this type of research being done systematically. Qualitative research on facilitators and barriers, because before that, we were still in like the little pilot study days in this area of interest. But let's say another decade goes by and there's another 10 papers in this area. You want to see another systematic review that adds to what we knew when this one was done. So when you're looking at a systematic review, you want to look at how old is this? How long ago was this done? Even if it was done a long time ago, it can still be valuable. But then you want to look at what's been published since that wasn't included in this systematic review that might contribute to what I know. So imagine that this was published in 2015 and not 2025. Well, the yoga landscape has changed dramatically, right? The way that yoga is offered, the accessibility movement has really changed the way that yoga is offered. And actually, it might be interesting in this review itself to look at what are the differences in barriers and facilitators from the work that was done in 2010, 2011 versus 2020, 2022, because we might actually see fewer barriers and more facilitators because the way that we deliver yoga has changed, but it's also specific to each of those particular studies and the methodology that each of those teams utilized. So you could still have a study that's done today where the yoga therapist is being too intrusive in the way that they ask questions, right? So that could still happen today. There could still be today a yoga study that's delivered where there aren't enough options or the right types of options being delivered. So even as there's a movement toward these types of practices, that doesn't mean that every study that's done is going to embody these types of practices. So I think that 9 papers is a good number of papers. It's, an interesting look. And, maybe 10 years from now, there are going to be 10 more papers or 20 more papers that will contribute even more. I would say also with qualitative research is incredibly labor intensive. There's a movement now for AI assisted qualitative research. I have mixed feelings about that. But qualitative research requires individual humans to go through transcripts of interviews that could be many pages long for each individual participant to comb through all of that, to code it based on what the ideas are that's being pulled out of there, right? It's not like a data set that you run through a statistical machine and it spits out your numbers. Not that quantitative research is easy. You have to really be mindful about how you write the code that's going to do that number crunching. But you don't have to look at each number individually. Well, okay, yeah, you kind of do when you clean up the data. But the point is, qualitative research is incredibly labor intensive, which is why the sample sizes on qualitative studies has to be so much smaller because the amount of information that you're getting for each participant is so robust. So qualitative data sets tend to be smaller, but the richness of the information for each participant is much greater. So with quantitative research, we would say a study of 20 people, that's a pilot study. That's not a lot of people, and it's not very generalizable. You would want to see, more like 100 participants. Well, in qualitative research, 20 people in a study is actually a lot because of how labor intensive it is and how much rich information you're getting from each person. What you do want to do is intentionally include a variety of different perspectives in the people that you're including in the study and also in the researchers themselves. So you saw that there are always two reviewers or more, and then another one that's going to look at the coding for any disagreements. But then you have a whole team of researchers that's going to synthesize all of that information, right? I forget how many, but I don't know, there were maybe 10 authors on this. In qualitative research, you want to get a bunch of different viewpoints, different perspectives, different backgrounds, because each person is necessarily bringing we would call it bias in quantitative research, but it's your lens, it's your perspective, it's your framework that you're going to bring to that work. And so you want to diversify that so that it's a well-rounded view of the data that you're looking at. I hope that helps. Any other questions or comments?
I have one more, but
Yeah,
I'll probably have to go because I have an appointment. So the other one is in meta-analysis, is there ever times that there are studies that are both qualitative and quantitative?
yeah.
And what is
So
the frequency of that?
yeah, great question, Lori. So oftentimes you have a study it's called mixed methods. What mixed methods mean is that they use both quantitative and qualitative methodology in the same study. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. Um, so the Middleton study that was cited here was actually a mixed method study in that we did collect actual quantitative metrics, right? We measured things like pain and stiffness and physical function and stress, et cetera, all quantitatively. And then we also looked at their journals. They shared their journals with us freely and interviews that we did with them. And that was the qualitative side. So you might see a single study that has used mixed methodology that publishes the quantitative and the qualitative findings together and says, here's what we found on fitness, on, psychological metrics, and then here are the barriers and facilitators. Looks like I froze for a moment. More often, what you're going to see is separate papers written from the same project, where in one paper they're reporting what they found quantitatively. Here are all of the validated instruments that we used and the metrics, and here's what we found numerically, statistically. And then there's going to be a separate paper that says, here are the journals, here are the interviews, here are the stories that they told us, here are the barriers and facilitators that we found. So those are different papers that came from the same mixed methods project. We do that because a single paper is limited in the number of words that we're allowed to use, and it's really hard to include that much information, all of the methods that were used from all of those different approaches in a single paper. Also, those papers may have different readership. The type of person that's going to be interested in how effective this program was may be different from the person who's going to be interested in the facilitators and barriers, or not even the person, but the paper that somebody else is writing and what they're looking for in the literature is going to be different. So if somebody's looking for measurable outcomes, we want them to find that. If somebody's looking for barriers and facilitators, we want them to find that. So we're probably going to publish those separately from the same project. And so if you're doing a systematic review, you would probably be looking for one or the other, because a systematic review is answering a specific question. Now, there are different types of reviews. Systematic reviews are not the only type of review. You could do a narrative review or a scoping review, and those types of reviews may draw from all different kinds of literature to get a general idea of what's been published on this topic overall. So if we do a scoping review of yoga for arthritis in general, what's everything that's been written about yoga for arthritis? I mean, that would be crazy because there's so much, but we could pool together all kinds of different papers. No problem, Lori. You can watch the recording of the rest of my answer. All kinds of different papers, and we could write an overall summary of everything that they all say. And then it's going to have qualitative and quantitative, but it's not going to be systematic, because systematic reviews have specific inclusion and exclusion criteria. And they're looking for papers that are all answering a similar kind of question or the same question. And a meta-analysis can't be done on a whole bunch of papers that are answering a whole bunch of different questions, right? So in order to do a meta-analysis, you have to start with a systematic review, which means it's answering all the same kind of question. And in a meta-analysis, you can only conduct the meta-analysis on the quantitative information that all uses the same outcome. So let's say, for example, we look at that specific example of yoga for blood pressure, like I had talked about earlier. Okay, all papers that measured yoga for blood pressure, but some of them were mixed methods. So some of them measured yoga for blood pressure and also asked people what their experience was like. Well, those could be included, but we can't include the qualitative data in the meta-analysis, because a meta-analysis, remember, is pooling all of the data into one data set in order to conduct statistical analysis on it. And it's worth noting, you can only conduct a meta-analysis when they use the same measure. So blood pressure is always using the same measure, right? Systolic, diastolic blood pressure, it's always the same measure. So a bunch of different studies that all measure blood pressure, we could pull all of that data together. But if we were looking at the effects of yoga on stress, and let's say one study used the perceived stress scale, and another study used the PROMIS stress interference. I don't think there is a PROMIS stress interference measure, but let's say they use a different measure of stress. Those are different instruments. We can't pool that into one data set because it's apples and oranges. So you can only include in the meta-analysis papers that use the same measure. So if we're doing a systematic review of yoga and stress, we might be able to conduct a meta-analysis, but we could only use the papers that used the same measure of stress in our meta-analysis for that systematic review. So hopefully that answers Lori's question about whether mixed methods can be included in a meta-analysis. Okay, Kylie, anything in the live? All right, I hope that this has been helpful, and if this is of interest to you, I hope that you'll go back. If you didn't get a chance to read this paper, I hope that this inspires you to go find it. We will make sure to link to the paper, and if you read it and want to come back with questions, add them to the thread in Facebook. We're happy to answer them after the fact. And if you're interested in more of this type of exploration and you want to hone your skills for being able to read, understand, and apply research literature alongside your expertise and what matters to the people that you serve, consider our 300-hour training that is based in research, ethics, accessibility, and discernment. And so we'll link to that as well. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.